Have you ever said, I saw it with my own eyes and later realized you were wrong? I'm not saying just lying, just wrong. A shadow looked like a person, a chart looked like a trend, maybe a headline looked like proof, and I know we're all guilty of that. What failed wasn't your eyesight. What failed was actually something much deeper. The move from having an impression to actually making an affirmation. That move is what Lonergan calls judgment. And if in episode 1 was about the click of insight, and episode 2 was about the way method guides insight, and then episode 3 about higher viewpoints, in this episode 9, is where the whole project becomes morally serious, because judgment is where we accept responsibility for what we claim is true. Today, I want to answer one question, and I want to answer it cleanly and concretely. When can you say yes? Not yes as in I can imagine it, not yes I've heard it, not yes if it's my worldview, but yes as in, is it so? And here's what we'll do. First, we'll locate judgment in the overall structure of knowing. Second, we'll unpack Lonergan's central idea that judgment is the grasp of a virtually unconditioned. Third, we'll walk through several everyday and scientific examples so you can feel the yes actually happen. And fourth, we'll end with a practical way to audit your own affirmation so you stop guessing and start judging. Let's begin with a reminder of the 3 levels. At the first level, you have experience, that is data, images, memories, testimony, measurements. At the second level, you have understanding, questions for intelligence, insights, formulations, your best attempt at what's going on here. But there's a third level that is easy to skip and easy to fake. The third level is reflection. The question, is it so? And the responsible answer, yes or no, or maybe not yet. Lonergan's point is blunt. He says that insight is not yet knowledge in the full sense. Insight gives you a possible explanation, a possible account, a possible pattern. Judgment is where you decide whether the evidence is sufficient to affirm that the explanation is true. And you can actually feel the difference in your own life. You can understand the claim and still not accept it. You can teach a theory and still say, honestly, I'm not convinced. So judgment is not more understanding. It's a different kind of act. It's an act that answers a different kind of question. A question for intelligence asks, what is it? Why? How? A question for reflection asks, is it really so? Now, Lonergan insists on something that's easy to miss. Between the question, is it so, and the answer, it is so, there's a distinct interior event that occurs. It's not merely emotion. It's not social pressure. It's not the feeling of, oh, it just feels right. What it is it's the weighing of evidence until you grasp that it is sufficient. And Lonergan says that without that grasp, if you say yes, you're just guessing. With that grasp, if you refuse to judge, you're being unreasonable because you've already seen that the conditions are met. That is the pivot of this episode. So, what is this grasp exactly? Lonergan gives it a technical name, the virtually unconditioned. This is the core. And if you understand this one idea, you'll understand why judgment is not arbitrary, not merely cultural, not relative, and not reducible to psychology. So let's do a setup here. Here's the setup. When you put a question for reflection to a proposition, when you ask, is it so, that proposition becomes, in Lonergan's language, a prospective judgment. It's a candidate for affirmation. But precisely because you've asked, is it so, you've made it conditional. It now stands in need of evidence. That is why Lonergan calls it a conditioned. Judgment is what happens when that conditioned becomes unconditioned. Not in the sense that it has no conditions, but in the sense that the conditions have been met. So Lonergan distinguishes two senses. A formally unconditioned statement would have no conditions at all. But we have to be honest. Most real judgments aren't like that at all. Most judgments are virtually unconditioned. They have conditions, but those conditions are fulfilled. And he says a virtually unconditioned has three elements. What are they? The first of these elements of the virtually unconditioned is the conditioned itself, the proposition you might affirm. The second, a link between that proposition and the conditions that would actually make it true. And third, the fulfillment of those conditions. When reflective understanding grasps those three together, when it grasps the conditioned, the link, and the fulfillment, then the prospective judgment becomes virtually unconditioned. And then what happens? Well, then the yes follows the rational necessity. And don't think of it as some sort of like forced coercion. It's not like that. Not forced like, I can't deny what I now see to be the case. No. This is why judgment is not merely optional decoration that we can just put on top of the cake of understanding. Judgment is the act that completes knowing. Now, that may be quite abstract. So I think it makes sense that we give a simple illustration first, and one that most people who have studied intro-level philosophy would know as deductive inference. So, if A, then B. A, therefore B. The conclusion B is conditioned. The link is the major premise. If A, then B. That's the major premise. The fulfillment of that major premise is the minor premise. A. We affirm that A actually is the case, right? If you grasp that structure, you grasp B as virtually unconditioned, and what happens? You can do nothing less than judge. But Lonergan immediately warns you, this form, deduction, this kind of inference is actually not the basic case, because deduction presupposes other judgments already. You have to already know that the premises are true. So, deduction is kind of like a clean model of the overall form. But it's missing something. It doesn't explain how judgment arises, emerges at its roots. So, let's go to the root cases then. Lonergan, what does he do? He turns to everyday judgments of fact, and he gives a vivid little scenario. Let's use it. A man leaves his house tidy in the morning. We can all imagine ourselves here. We leave our house clean. He comes back in the evening and finds broken windows, maybe smoke in the air, waters on the floor, and he makes a very restrained judgment. Something happened. I'm sure most of us would jump to something else, but that's a restrained judgment. Something happened. Now, notice what's doing the work. The condition is something happened. The fulfillment of conditions is present and remembered data. The remembered order, the present disorder. But what about the link? It's not like the most basic deductive inference case, right? It's not formal syllogism. He doesn't say, if a house was intact and now it's smashed, then something happened. He just knows it. The link is an operative structure in consciousness. It's the way we know change, the way we identify the same thing across time and register difference as difference. This is crucial for Lonergan's thought. In judgment, the link between conditioned and conditions is not a proposition you explicitly recite. What is it then? Well, it's an intelligent and reasonable procedure already operating in you. Reflective understanding can make use of those rudimentary elements, experience, recognition, insight, so as to reach the virtually unconditioned. That is how judgment is possible without being a formal proof every time. We just don't live in that kind of world. Now, this helps us correct a common distortion. People often think, I judged because I had a strong impression, or I judged because it seemed obvious. Lonergan's analysis is different. It's not about intensity of the impression. It's about sufficiency of evidence. A vivid, powerful impression can be wrong, and a faint impression can be correct. What actually matters is whether in reflection you can identify the conditions and whether those conditions are fulfilled. Now, let's push one step deeper. Sometimes the question isn't, did something happen? Sometimes the question is my understanding correct? That is, you've had an insight. You formed an explanation. But now you want to know whether the explanation is right or whether you're just pleased with yourself. Lonergan says there are judgments that directly concern the correctness of insights. And what he does is he actually gives us a pretty striking criterion for that. The link here is an insight is correct if there are no further pertinent questions. Not no further questions at all, not no further skeptical possibilities, but no further pertinent questions, no relevant questions that, if answered, would overturn or modify the insight. And the fulfillment of conditions lies in the self-correcting process of learning, reaching a limit, familiarity, mastery. So, in other words, what does that mean? In other words, you test, you probe, you maybe try to falsify, to break your own idea. You return to the data, those impressions. Maybe you look for counter instances. You recheck your initial assumptions. And gradually, inquiry quiets down. Not because you're tired, no, although that could be the case, but because the pertinent questions have been answered. That quieting is not a laziness on your part. It's the signature of reflective sufficiency. This is why Lonergan thinks genuine knowing is dynamic. We do not start with certainty. We start with questions. We move toward understanding. Then we submit understanding to reflection. And only then do we affirm. We say, this is so. Now, from here, Lonergan extends the pattern into generalization in science. How do you move from this case is so to cases of this kind are so? And he gives a cognitional law. Similars are similarly understood. Generalization is not some sort of leap of enthusiasm. What it actually is an extension under conditions. The fulfillment depends on the relevant similarity between such that, in general cases, no pertinent questions arise beyond those already settled in the understood particular case. And scientific verification is precisely the disciplined version of this. How? What do we see? You propose. You test. You replicate. Maybe you look for where it fails. You define the various domains of validity. And gradually, as you go through this, a claim becomes not merely conceivable, but responsibly affirmable. Now, Lonergan, of course, also emphasizes probability. There are cases where you have evidence, but not decisive evidence. You can still make a reasonable judgment there, but it will be qualified. Not is it so, right? Or it is so in an absolute sense, but it's probably so. It's likely. It's supported within limits. Lonergan treats this as a real form of rational affirmation rather than as some sort of hand waving to explain away things. Because reflection is not only about absolute certainty, it's about proportioning assent to evidence. Now, let's pause a moment and put the whole thing into a simple, usable structure for us so that it doesn't remain abstract, doesn't remain solely an idea. If you want to know whether you may say yes, you can ask 3 questions. The first is, what exactly am I affirming? Name that proposition. You can write it down. You have to make it explicit. The second question, what would have to be the case for this proposition to be true? That is the link. The conditions. Sometimes those conditions are logical premises, like we already explained when we talk about deductive inference. Sometimes they're empirical indicators. Sometimes they're things like procedural requirements, like if the instruments are calibrated, if the sample is representative, if the confound is controlled, etc., etc. The third question, are those conditions fulfilled? Not fulfilled in a vague way. No, it's not a vibe, not like just a feeling, right? Are those conditions fulfilled in the way the situation demands? Present data, remembered data. Do we have trustworthy records? Maybe replicated measurements? The elimination of pertinent further questions. When you can answer all 3 of these questions, you have what Lonergan calls, what we've already mentioned, is the virtually unconditioned. And then saying yes is not just a preference. It's not something you just feel. It is the reasonable completion of inquiry. Now, why does this matter beyond something like personal epistemic hygiene? Well, because this is where Lonergan breaks with both naive empiricism and sophisticated relativism. Empiricism tends to think knowing is basically taking a good look, then reporting what you see. It's a naive realism. I take the imminent as true, nothing beyond. I stay within that horizon. And Lonergan replies saying, seeing gives you the data, but it doesn't give you truth. It's the first level of cognitional structure. It's attending to the data of sense. Truth happens at the 3rd level, not even at the 2nd level, the 3rd level of judgment. Relativism, on the other side, recognizes that experience alone doesn't yield knowledge and that interpretation is involved. But where does it fail? Well, it tends to collapse truth into nothing but mere coherence, or into a total system we never achieve or never can achieve. Lonergan counters this, and his counter is relatively simple, but still sharp. We do in fact make judgments of fact, and the relativists cannot establish that there are no facts, because even the claim there are no facts would function as a fact claim. So the escape of relativism is not to pretend interpretation doesn't exist. No, that would be a false move. The escape is to recognize that knowing has a 3rd level. We do not only interpret the sense data that is given to us. No. We also reflect on that data, that which is present, that which is remembered. We ask, in that reflection, is it so? Is this actually true? Is it the case? Is it a fact? And sometimes we can responsibly answer yes. And Lonergan goes further. He goes further saying that judgment, this third level of our cognitional structure, is not merely a technical act in logic. It is the foundation of intellectual virtue, because it is precisely where you accept or refuse the demand to be reasonable. This is why, when judgment weakens, whole cultures drift, and the longer cycle of decline has its beginning. People become fluent in insights, it's true. They become fluent in arguments, in narratives, in frames, and allergic to affirmations that are grounded in evidence. When the conditioned becomes virtually unconditioned, then they can explain everything, but they can't say yes responsibly, or at least they say yes cheaply. Lonergan's analysis is meant to restore a kind of moral spine to thinking. Now, that being said, let me bring this down to something you can recognize immediately. Take any claim. Think of any claim you currently believe. Don't think of a trivial one. Something important. Something with real weight. Something with the weight of history, of politics, of theology, of science. Something with weight in your own life. Now, with that in mind, keep it present. I want you to ask, is that belief actually a judgment in Lonergan's sense, what we've described up until now? Or is it more like an adopted view, a view that is held on authority, on community, on mood, on habit? Lonergan is not saying that those beliefs are always wrong. What he's saying is they're not the same act. They're not the act that we've described. Judgment strictly is motivated by your own grasp of the unconditioned, your own reflective sufficiency. Belief can be reasonable, but it has a different structure because it involves trust in collaboration. If you confuse belief with judgment, you will either become gullible, that is, treating social trust as proof, or you can become cynical, treating all trust as irrational. Lonergan's position, his point, is more discriminating than those low resolution modes. They are different modes of assent. And in every case, the question is, what are the conditions and are they fulfilled? Now, there's a danger. Here's a danger that hits especially hard in academic life for those of you who are in it. We get very good at level 2. We produce interpretations, okay? We spin explanations. We generate frameworks. We learn to sound intelligent. But we quietly lose the discipline of level 3, that reflective level. We stop asking, is it so, in any real, genuine, demanding sense? Or we ask it, but we treat it as a rhetorical flourish rather than a real constraint. Lonergan's remedy is not a new theory to this. No. It's what he calls self-appropriation. It's learning to notice in yourself that very real interior difference between I can explain this and I have sufficient evidence to affirm this. One of these ways produces essays, papers, articles. Sure, okay. The other produces truth claims you can actually stand behind. You've exhausted all the pertinent questions. You're left with nothing else but that forced affirmation to the truth. Now let's take one more example, because it makes the structure that we're describing much more vivid. Imagine you're doing research and you have a beautiful result. Let's say your model fits in what you perceive to be the ideal structure. Your p-values are clean. Your graph looks like destiny. It's perfect. It's great. You want to say something like, we've shown that X causes Y. But if you're operating at the level of judgment, you actually slow down. You ask, what exactly is the proposition I aim about to affirm? Is that proposition, is it a correlation? Is it a causation? Is it within this specific sample that we're looking at? Is it given these boundary conditions? Is it more limited in that capacity? Is it more constrained by those boundary conditions? Then you ask for the link. What conditions must be met for a causal claim? Is there temporal ordering? Is there a plausible mechanism? Have we perhaps ruled out all the confounders? Does the effect replicate? Then you ask about fulfillment. And maybe, after all of that, you still say yes. But the yes is different than the yes previously when you looked at your model, the perfect graph. The yes is now precise. It's now proportioned. And if the conditions are not fulfilled, you don't say yes just because you want to publish. The restraint is not cowardice. That is the very dignity of judgment. Now, what should you practice after this episode? What's the aim here? What do we want to take away from all of this? Here's a simple discipline that takes 2 minutes of your time, and it changes your intellectual life completely. Pick just one proposition you're tempted to affirm strongly this week. May not have occurred yet. Keep this question in mind when something pops up. Write it down. Write it. Don't just keep it in your mind. Write that down, that proposition that you're tempted to affirm strongly, as a single sentence. Then, underneath that sentence, write beneath it, what conditions would make this true? List three conditions that would make that true. Then I want you to ask, are they actually fulfilled? Or am I treating assumptions as evidence? If they are fulfilled, say yes cleanly. If they are not fulfilled, don't say yes at all. You can say something else, such as possibly, probably, I don't know, not yet. And I know that they may sound like weak words, but they're not. They're not at all. Not in this phase of reflection. Those are the words of someone who refuses to merely guess and pass it off as fact, pass it off as assent to truth. And that, for Lonergan, is what it means to be reasonable. So, all that being said, let's bring this back home now. Judgment, keep this in mind, is not a mood. It's not sentiment. It's not a social posture. It's not a false humility. It's not the intensity of the conviction. What it actually is the act that follows when reflective understanding grasps that the evidence is sufficient, when the prospective judgment becomes virtually unconditioned. It is that when you can say yes reasonably. And that is why knowing is not just seeing. Knowing culminates in judgment. Now, in the next episode, we're going to push this into a very concrete question. Can you make at least one judgment that is unavoidable? One that, if you try to deny it, collapses entirely into incoherence? Lonergan's answer is that self-affirmation of the knower, that is, it's not a mystical slogan, no, but a judgment of fact that is grounded in the very operations you're performing when you inquire and reflect. So, if you want the rest of the series to have teeth, this is why you should stay for what comes next. And if this episode helped, I'd ask you to like the video, to subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next step, because we're building this course in order, and each episode is meant to sublate the last.